Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
My cousin raised his wine glass over the turkey and said, "Let's thank Aunt Linda for paying off my student loans." I nearly choked on my stuffing. That was my college fund. The one I was told didn't exist anymore. The room burst into polite laughter, the kind of canned applause families reserve for self-congratulations disguised as humility. Jake grinned like he'd just won an award, his cheeks already pink from too much wine and too many compliments. Aunt Linda, seated at the head of the table like some self-appointed empress of the casserole empire, smiled demurely and waved her hand like it was nothing, just a little holiday generosity. I stared at my plate, swirling a fork through gravy I suddenly didn't feel like eating anymore, my chest tightening in a way that didn't feel entirely emotional. Jake always knew how to soak up the spotlight without even breaking a sweat. From the time we were kids, he had this way of commanding the room, first with dimples, then with charm, and now with stories of how hard he's worked to bounce back from debt. He went to private school, spent semesters abroad in places I couldn't afford to visit, let alone study in, and always had some job lined up thanks to Uncle Rick's connections. And yet, here he was, bragging about how Aunt Linda stepped in to wipe out his student loans, as if the fairy godmother of financial freedom had just waved a wand over his already padded life. I looked across the table at my mom, who was refilling cranberry sauce like nothing out of the ordinary had just happened. She didn't flinch. She didn't look up. I leaned slightly toward her and said, just low enough for the sound to get lost in the noise, "What loans?" She didn't meet my eyes. She just whispered, "He needed it more," and kept scooping. In that moment, something inside me cracked, not in a dramatic, scream and run out of the room way, but in a colder, quieter way, the kind of crack that splits something deep and foundational and doesn't immediately make a sound. I sat back in my chair, nodded slowly, and picked up my wine glass with a hand that was way too steady for what I was feeling. They had told me the fund was gone. When I was 17, right before college applications were due, Mom sat me down in the kitchen and explained that things had changed. The market had tanked, the fund took a hit, and there was just not enough left to get you where you want to go. She told me community college was a smart move, practical, affordable. She promised I'd transfer in 2 years, maybe even one, and Aunt Linda had co-signed a small loan to help me along the way. At the time, I nodded and swallowed it because what else do you do when you're a kid who doesn't want to make waves during a storm you didn't create? But something about the way she said he needed it more pulled every thread loose. I had done the practical thing. I worked 3 jobs while taking classes part-time. I studied from the break room of a hardware store and wrote essays in the back seat of my car on a hotspot that dropped every 20 minutes. I went without, and not once did anyone raise a glass to me. I let the rest of dinner pass in a blur. Jake kept talking, of course, about real estate, about crypto, about how it feels good to finally be debt-free. Aunt Linda beamed like she'd just funded a hospital wing, and Mom just kept serving pie like her daughter's education had never been sliced in half for the sake of someone else's dream. As soon as dessert was served and the attention shifted to Aunt Linda's lemon chest tart, I excused myself. I said I had something in the car I forgot, which was true, but no one cared enough to ask what it was. They probably assumed I needed a minute to compose myself, which I did, but not in the way they were thinking. I walked out into the cold night air, the crunch of leaves under my boots the only sound loud enough to ground me. My car sat under the edge of the driveway light, dusted with the beginning of frost. I opened the passenger door, reached into the glove compartment, and pulled out the manila envelope I hadn't opened in over 5 years. It was labeled in faded Sharpie, 529 plan statements, Hannah. I had kept them not out of spite, but out of instinct, because somewhere in me I knew I might need proof one day. I flipped through the pages slowly, letting my breath fog the inside of the window. There were line items, deposits, and eventually withdrawals. And right there, in black and white, was a $15,000 transfer dated exactly 2 weeks before Jake started at Princeton. I closed the envelope, rested it in my lap, and sat there in silence while the rest of the family laughed over coffee and whipped cream. I had waited long enough. And if the receipts weren't enough to make them choke on their gratitude, then my voice would be. I was 17 when Mom sat me down at the kitchen table and told me the college fund was gone. She said it so gently, like she was sparing me some awful pain, but I remember how her voice wavered on the word gone, and how her hands kept folding and unfolding a napkin while she talked. It wasn't dramatic, not some outburst or weepy moment. It was clinical, quiet, and for some reason that made it feel worse. She said the market had hit it hard, that there just wasn't anything left, and maybe I wouldn't understand now, but I would someday. She kept saying that, like it was supposed to soften the blow. You'll understand one day, Hannah. I nodded slowly, because what else do you do when the person who's always kept the house running, the person you trust to keep the lights on and the fridge stocked, tells you there's no money for the one thing you've spent your entire teenage life working toward? She said community college would be smarter anyway. You'll save money, you can work part-time, and then transfer. It's a good path, honey. Plenty of kids do it. I could tell she'd rehearsed that part. She leaned on it like a sales pitch she was forced to deliver. I didn't argue. I just said okay and went upstairs to stare at the rejection letter from the one school I had actually dared to dream about. I hadn't even told her I applied to it, because I already felt selfish wanting something that big. What I didn't understand then, what I didn't allow myself to ask, was how Jake had already been accepted to Princeton and wasn't blinking at the price tag. He was 3 years older, already a sophomore when I had that conversation with Mom. And every time someone brought up the tuition, the answer was always some vague mix of scholarships and Aunt Linda's help, as if the universe had simply opened its arms to him while the rest of us had to tighten our belts and pray. I remember Mom saying tuition was $30,000 a year, which meant 4 years would be like $160,000. Or maybe more. I'm not great with numbers. Back then, I told myself Jake was just lucky, that his grades were better, or he had the right connections, or maybe Aunt Linda just liked him more because he smiled more and wore collared shirts and never challenged her on anything. I pushed the questions down, filed them away like receipts you don't want to look at because you already know they'll make your stomach turn. But sitting in my car on Thanksgiving night, holding that envelope in my hands and flipping through the statements, I could feel all those push-down questions clawing their way back up like they'd been waiting years to breathe. The first few pages were standard: deposits, investment tracking, those little upticks and dips that mean nothing to a teenager and everything to a financial advisor. Then came the withdrawals. The first one was dated August 22nd, just before Jake's sophomore year. It was for $15,000. The memo line said tuition disbursement. I stared at it, then turned the page. Another withdrawal, 9 months later, for $13,000. Books, fees, housing. It went on like that line after line, year after year, until the fund was drained. Not by market losses. Not by bad luck. But by someone else's education. That was my name on the envelope, my future in those columns. I had been told it was gone, vanished, a casualty of the times. But here it was, clear as day, with numbers and dates that lined up perfectly with Jake's rise through one of the most expensive universities in the country. The same Jake who stood at the table hours ago and toasted Aunt Linda like she'd handed him a golden ticket, when really she'd handed him my shot at something better than scraping by. I held the pages in my lap like they might catch fire, my fingertips starting to numb from the cold creeping through the cracked window. And the longer I stared at those numbers, the less I felt like crying. What I felt instead was something deeper, something older. Rage, yes, but also clarity. It was like waking up after years of pretending to sleep, seeing everything exactly as it had always been. I closed the folder slowly, took one deep breath, and walked back toward the house. The porch light was still glowing, and I could hear laughter inside, silverware clinking on dessert plates, the same tired jokes being told for the 100th time. They didn't know what I had in my hands. They didn't know I had proof. And they sure as hell didn't expect me to use it. I stepped inside, walked straight to the dining room, and didn't wait for silence. I opened the folder, pulled out the first page, and read aloud, August 22nd. Tuition disbursement. $15,000. The room went dead quiet. And I wasn't finished. I walked back into that dining room like I'd been waiting to do it my whole damn life, and maybe, in some slow, invisible way, I had. Nobody noticed me at first. Grandma was asking someone to pass the whipped cream. Jake was still rambling about a guy he knew from business school who just bought a cabin in Vermont, and Aunt Linda was mid-laugh over some story I didn't care to catch the end of. It wasn't until I cleared my throat that the room finally turned toward me, faces soft with confusion and half-eaten dessert. I didn't sit down. I didn't wait for silence to stretch long enough to make it awkward. I just opened the folder in my hands, pulled out the top page, and began reading. August 22nd, I said, loud enough to cut through the murmur. Tuition disbursement. $15,000. Jake blinked, looking up from his pie like I'd just started reciting scripture. Aunt Linda cocked her head like she wasn't quite sure what she was hearing, and my mother, God help her, closed her eyes, just for a moment, like she knew exactly what this was. I didn't pause. May 15th, book reimbursement. $675. October 3rd, housing stipend. $9,240. I flipped the page. February 21st, student account balance. $11,900. March 12th, supplemental fee adjustment. $1,302. That's when Jake finally spoke. What is that? He said, trying to sound casual, but his voice cracked halfway through the question. I looked at him like he was an empty chair. These are the withdrawals made from the college fund set up in my name, I said. The one I was told didn't exist anymore. No one moved. No one breathed. Aunt Linda reached for her water glass like her throat had dried up, but she didn't take a sip. My mom stared at her lap like the answers might have crawled into the stitching of the tablecloth. I don't understand, Aunt Linda finally said, her voice tight with confusion, or the performance of it. That fund was always for the family. I turned to her. No, I said, voice sharp. That fund was set up by Grandpa when I was 5 years old, specifically for me. It had my name on it. It was managed under my social security number. You're telling me you thought it was just a communal pot? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Jake let out a forced little laugh, the kind that only shows up when someone's realizing they're not as bulletproof as they thought. Come on, Han, he said, leaning forward like we were old buddies sharing a joke. You're not seriously mad about this. I blinked at him. You're not seriously asking me that right now. It's not like I stole it, he said, and now he was getting defensive, because the silence wasn't protecting him anymore. I didn't even know it was your fund. They just told me the money was there and I needed it for tuition. What was I supposed to do? Turn it down? Yes, I said, without hesitation. That's exactly what you were supposed to do. Mom finally found her voice, soft and trembling. We didn't have a choice, sweetie. You were always so strong. You made it work. Jake was struggling. I turned toward her, and for a second I didn't recognize the woman who raised me. No, I said, he was expensive. There's a difference. The silence was suffocating now, heavy and breathless, and every person at that table looked like they wanted to crawl under the floorboards. I looked at Aunt Linda again, then back to Jake, and finally back to my mother, who had gone pale. I worked nights and weekends, I said, barely able to keep the edge out of my voice. I missed holidays. I missed sleep. I missed life because you said there was nothing left. Meanwhile, Jake was flying to Italy for a study abroad semester and buying limited edition sneakers like he was investing in real estate. Jake's face twisted. So what? He snapped, slamming his hand on the table so hard the plates rattled. I used it. I needed it. I looked at him calmly, the page still in my hand. So did I. And that was the truth of it, sharp, raw, undeniable. He needed it, maybe, but so did I. And nobody asked. The silence that followed Jake's outburst wasn't empty. It was thick, crawling up the walls, pressing down on the ceiling, and settling over every fork and napkin like smoke from something already smoldering underneath. For a second, no one dared breathe too loud, as if my cousin slamming his hand on the table had cracked something sacred, something we all knew was fragile, but pretended could never actually break. And then, right on cue, the unraveling began. Aunt Linda was the first to speak, because of course she was. She sat up straighter, pushed her plate slightly forward as if giving herself more stage, and adopted the tone of someone used to managing crises, with a checkbook and a brittle smile. "This was a family decision," she said slowly, like she was explaining taxes to a child. "It was discussed at length between your mother and me, and we made what we believed was the right choice for everyone involved." I couldn't help it, I laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was sharp and short and bitter enough to cut through the polished veneer of civility she was still clinging to like pearls. "A family decision," I repeated, nodding like I was finally understanding something I'd never been allowed to be part of. "You mean, two people decided behind closed doors to take money that belonged to me and hand it to the person who already had every other door held open for him. Diane, my mother, the woman who once told me she'd go without heat to keep me in piano lessons, finally found her voice, but she didn't use it the way I'd hoped. We didn't know what else to do," she said, her face pale, hands clasped tight on the edge of the table. Jake was struggling. He had no other help. "You always seemed so capable, Hannah. You were working, you were handling things on your own." It just made sense at the time. There it was again. That same phrase I'd heard since I was 17, like a broken refrain looping through every letdown and betrayal I'd been too tired to challenge. It just made sense. As if logic was a valid substitute for fairness. As if making it make sense somehow washed the blood from the blade. "What about what made sense for me?" I asked, my voice quieter now, but sharper. "Did anyone ever ask me how I felt about carrying 5 figures of debt for a degree I barely had time to pursue because I was also working shifts until 2 in the morning?" Aunt Linda's mouth opened, but I didn't let her get a word in. Did anyone think I might have needed that money too? That maybe I wanted more than just scraping by at a community college while Jake had a dorm view of the East River and a monthly stipend for unexpected needs. Jake stood up suddenly, pacing behind his chair like a man on trial who can't stand to hear the charges read aloud. "It wasn't my idea," he said, turning to my mother now, looking for someone to share the blame. "I was told it was family money. I didn't ask for her college fund." "No," I said, looking him dead in the eye, "you just took it." The room was a graveyard now. Plates still full, drinks untouched, pie slowly melting into soggy crusts. Everyone sitting with different shades of shame or shock or denial on their faces. I wasn't screaming. I wasn't crying. But the words I said next weren't for debate. I sacrificed. I worked through holidays. I deferred my dreams so someone else could keep theirs on schedule. You handed him a shortcut and told me I should be proud of how well I walk uphill. Diane's eyes welled up, but no tears fell. Aunt Linda pressed her napkin to her lips, like she needed something to absorb the blow. Jake muttered something under his breath, too quiet for anyone to catch, but I didn't care. I wasn't here for them to explain it away. Then, from the far end of the table, where she'd been uncharacteristically quiet all evening, Grandma Joan finally spoke. Her voice was low but firm, laced with the kind of finality that only matriarchs can pull off. She looked straight at me, her eyes more tired than usual, and said, "You're making this about money. That fund was for the one who could do the most with it." The words hit the table like a dropped glass, and for a second I felt 14 again, too quiet, too sensitive, too smart for my own good. But I wasn't 14, and I wasn't going to let this story be written without the truth. So I stared right back at her, didn't blink, didn't smile, and said I did. It didn't unravel in an explosion. It collapsed in fragments, like a house slowly giving into rot, one beam at a time. After I said what I said to Grandma, the table didn't erupt into shouting like you might expect from a scene like that. No one leapt across the mashed potatoes or flung a wine glass at the wall. What happened was worse. In a way, it just went still. No one looked directly at me, but no one looked away either. Jake sat back down like gravity had suddenly gotten heavier. Aunt Linda clutched her pearls like they might ground her. My mother, she just stared at the candle in the center of the table as if maybe it would burn the moment away if she willed it hard enough. And then, of course, Jake had to break the silence. That was always his role, say something just loud and sharp enough to keep himself from having to actually feel anything. "You've always resented me," he snapped, his voice thin and cracking. "You act like I've just had it easy my whole life, but you don't know what kind of pressure I was under." I laughed, and this time it wasn't bitter, it was tired. The kind of laugh you let out when someone repeats a lie so many times they actually start believing it. "Jake," I said, "you were carried." I was cut loose. That's the difference. He stood up, muttering something under his breath, grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair, and stormed out the front door without looking back. The screen slammed behind him like punctuation, the kind you can still hear echoing hours later. No one followed him. No one even suggested someone should. Aunt Linda sat frozen for a while longer, her fork still half raised, like she wasn't sure whether to take another bite or throw it across the room. Eventually, she placed it gently on the plate, dabbed at her dry eyes with the corner of her napkin, and said quietly, "I was trying to help." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She wasn't speaking to me. She was speaking to the story she'd always told herself, the version of the family where everything made sense and choices were fair and her money always went to the person who would use it best. Mom finally spoke then, her voice barely louder than a breath. "I didn't know it would turn out like this." That line, God, that line, stung more than I expected, because it wasn't cruel. It was just cowardly. And I realized, sitting there, that was what hurt the most. Not the money. Not the loans. Not even the missed chances. What hurt was knowing my mother didn't fight for me. Not really. She let someone else decide who was worth more and then pretended her hands were tied. I stood up slowly, folding the receipts back into the manila envelope with the same deliberate care I'd taken when I first printed them all those years ago. My fingers lingered on the edge of the folder for a second longer than they needed to, not because I was second-guessing, but because I knew what came next was the last thing they'd remember. I walked over to the head of the table where Aunt Linda had placed her purse, set the folder down on the linen runner, and pulled a small slip of paper from my coat pocket. I placed it on top of the folder and slid it slightly forward until it caught her attention. The note read, "For the next time someone needs it more." I didn't wait for a reaction. I didn't want one. I walked out through the front door and didn't look back, not even when the cold hit my face like a slap, or when I passed Jake's car sitting crooked in the driveway with the engine still warm. When I got into my car and shut the door, the silence was complete. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of pretense. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I owed anyone a version of myself that made them more comfortable. I sat there for a minute, engine off, and stared through the windshield at the house that raised me, then broke me, and then finally taught me the only lesson worth learning. They made a decision a long time ago. And now, so had I. I won't lie and pretend I drove away feeling victorious. I didn't pump my fist or blast music or smile at my reflection in the mirror. I didn't feel good, but I did feel clean. And that, I've learned, is the kind of peace you don't always get with justice, but you can get it with truth. As I reached for my keys, I glanced at the passenger seat where the empty envelope had landed. The paper that once held all their secrets was gone, but its weight was still there, just different now. It didn't belong to me anymore. I had carried it long enough. I didn't read the receipts to punish them. I read them so they'd finally stop pretending I imagined it all. If fairness was never on the menu, at least truth could be the side dish.